Okay, I wanted to record a brief little video about the passing of Jose Baselga. I was caught off guard to hear it this weekend, and I was, in fact, quite sad to hear it, which might come as a surprise to people who had followed the interactions I'd had with Dr. Baselga over the years. But you might not have known. We had crossed paths a few more times than just the public stages, and I always had quite a great deal of admiration for Baselga. I literally, every time I saw him, I always brought a smile to my face, and we would always exchange some comments. And I learned a lot from his work, and I thought it might be helpful, at least to myself and maybe to others, to talk a little bit about why I had such feelings towards him. So first, I was really sad to hear that he passed away this weekend. He was only 61 years old, too young, and I heard that the cause was CJD, which is very unfortunate. I think the first time, just to give listeners a sense, I think I've crossed paths with Dr. Baselga a few times over the last decade. The first time I met him was, I think, in 2013 at the pertuzumab ODAC. Of course, pertuzumab was coming up for neoadjuvant approval. And we knew that pertuzumab in combination with trastuzumab could generate a higher pathologic complete response rate. But the FDA had never used PathCR as a surrogate marker, and this was the regulatory question. And Baselga, of course, was a speaker on behalf of Genentech to support the approval. And I have no doubt that, he was and remains a, true believer that pertuzumab truly is an important drug in the adjuvant space. And, we can debate whether or not it should be offered to node negative or node positive patients, and that's its own debate. But what struck me at this ODAC was, of course, Tito Fojo, who is then the program director of the National Cancer Institute. He was on the panel, and there was a really great exchange between Baselga and Fojo about the implications of the Cleopatra study. So, I think one of the arguments for the approval of pertuzumab was that, yes, we know it improves PathCR, but we also know one more thing. We know in the metastatic setting, it clearly is associated with a significant benefit, and there's something like a 16-month OS benefit in the Cleopatra trial, where, of course, pertuzumab was added to trastuzumab and taxane in metastatic breast cancer. And people thought that, perhaps that metastatic result, which is so dramatic, would give one a little bit more oomph to kind of approve it in the adjuvant space. And Tito, made an interesting point, which was that in Cleopatra, you don't know with what rate people post-protocol on the control arm were getting a HER2-directed therapy in the second and third line of therapies. And I think, ultimately that result shook out at something like 80%. But if you were really running that trial in the United States, it would probably have been close to 100% in those years. So Tito's point, I think, was fundamentally that at least some of that 16-month difference in Cleopatra was attributable to the fact that by taking pertuzumab, you actually got more trastuzumab because the PFS was delayed. You got more doses of trastuzumab in your body, and some of that 16 months would have been mitigated if you had given trastuzumab post-protocol to all people in the control arm. And Baselga, of course, I think he handled the question quite gracefully, and ultimately, I know I've written about this, so no surprise where I fall on this issue, but, I think you got to give Baselga credit. And of course, the drug got the regulatory approval. But I was impressed by his fire in his belly when I first saw him in 2013. I crossed paths with Baselga a few years later. He came to the National Cancer Institute to give a lunch, and there were a few fellows who were invited to have lunch with him and ask him questions. And, like many of such events, it was awfully quiet. So I thought, I'd toss a question out. I think the question I asked Baselga was, this was back when data sharing was all in vogue and trial level data sharing was particularly discussed. And I asked him, well, what do you think about data sharing, Dr. Baselga? You run many pivotal trials. How would you feel if, third party said, we want access to some of your data because we could potentially learn something that you hadn't studied and you didn't have time to study, and maybe take this data set and stretch it further. I also hear there's an ethical argument. Patients feel like when they consent to trials, they believe that that data will be used for all of science. What do you think about this? And that was when I started to really see his personality, because he was totally honest. He was totally honest. And he said, what are you talking about? What is this data sharing? I said, you give some data over and we reanalyze it. He says, which data do you want? You want my data? You want my data from the trial? I said, whoever runs the trial, I guess that's what we're talking about that data. And he says, you think you're going to get my data? You're going to get my data? He said, "Oh no, you have your data and I have my data, and we're going to keep it that way." And I thought it was refreshing to just hear somebody say that absolutely not. I am not down with data sharing. I don't care what you're going to do with it. This is mine and that's yours, and so be it. And I don't know. He was just brimming with confidence, and I think people who've interacted with him will see that he is extremely passionate, extremely confident, and no matter how you feel about any issue, you have to admire that in somebody. I admire that in an interlocutor. I admire that in somebody who's willing to push back on you and say what they think and not sugarcoat it. And in this world of academic medicine, that is rare. Um, so, of course, I went off to do my first faculty job in Oregon. And over the years, we crossed paths a few times in the literature. I'd written something, and he had criticism of it. He had written something, I had criticism of it, that kind of thing. I think in 2017, I was on a panel and somebody asked me whether I thought every cancer patient should get whole genome sequencing. These were back in the years when there's a lot of lobbying on foundation, or not foundation, there's a lot of lobbying to get Medicare to pay for some broad genome panel. And I felt that that was a premature coverage decision. It was going to cost a couple billion a year. And that doesn't include all the downstream costs of investigational drugs that were going to be given in this sort of absolutely undocumented N of 1 times 1,000 experimentation. And I said that, I don't think they should cover it, and it was premature. And I think those comments, some people may have picked up on it, and they scheduled the Great Debate. Great Debate AACR 2018 was between myself and another person, my contemporary around my age, David Hyman, who was, clearly a star in precision oncology at the time, and had done really, I think, important work and important publications. And at least, even if I am someone who disagreed with whether or not insurers should pay for something, I'm someone who has to recognize that in part, a lot of the data that I was using to make my case was, developed by Baselga and Hyman. So, many of us who are critical of insurance coverage, of policy, of medical practice, we also have to have some respect for those who we disagree with, because, we're often working based on a different interpretation of some of their work. And so anyway, this was the Great Debate. And I think it was sort of hotly anticipated on Twitter because I had been a provocative person on Twitter, perhaps even more so back then. And of course, they picked the most impartial moderator, Jose Baselga, who's obviously going to have an affinity for his guy, for David. But I went and beforehand, and he had some kind things to say, and David gave his lecture, and I thought it was really good. I mean, I think the world of David. I think he's a very smart guy, and the way he framed and conceptualized the question was ironically actually really similar to how I conceptualized the question, except he just had a different interpretation of the ultimate result. What do you do with knowing that X% of U.S. cancer patients are currently benefiting from genome-driven therapy? Is that a glass half full situation, glass half empty situation, that kind of thing? I forget the exact prompt. It's something like genome-driven oncology is ready for prime time or something like that. However, we had an ace up our sleeve a little bit, I think. I don't know how people who attended the debate felt, but a lot of people thought it was a good spirited debate. But the ace up our sleeve was, I put a lot of energy and got my team to sort of reorient around this question, and we spent a lot of time investigating what we think the upper bound of how many people were benefiting from genome-driven therapy. And I think that number was something like 9% of people were eligible for genome-targeted drugs. And we timed it so that as I was giving my debate, literally on HemeOncology website, the article would drop with the estimate, and that was kind of like my final slide, kind of like the mic drop. And I don't know. I think it connected a little bit. It was a crowd that was clearly on the other side, I think. And then we went to the Q&A, and Baselga was just characteristically Baselga, which is, he said, I'm supposed to be the moderator. And I'm paraphrasing here just based on memory. I'm supposed to be the moderator here, but I have to say everything David said is right and everything you said is wrong. Something like that. Just something like totally unabashedly how we actually felt about things. But you got to love that about somebody. I mean, you got to love that about somebody, especially in this world where people are so reluctant to put themselves out there. And I did like that about him. And he had some other kind of choice comments, which was fine, which is the nature of the game. You got to play the game. You got to play it. If you want to fight this issue, you got to be able to fight. And I appreciated that. Then I guess a couple of years went by, and of course the conflict of interest thing came up that I think Jose hadn't disclosed, conflicts that he felt were not relevant, but that I think you could arguably make the case that they are relevant. And I think people who follow me will know that, there's no secret how I feel about conflicts of interest and disclosure, and actually even more, probably recusal in most cases. But I guess I felt about it always a little bit of that, Jose was never, it was never about Jose, and that was the problem. And with I think what had happened after that, um, there's that old quote by Upton Sinclair when he wrote The Jungle. I aimed for their heart and I hit him in the stomach, meaning he got food safety regulations passed, but didn't get kind of worker protections passed. And similarly, the kind of the story of Jose Baselga and the conflict of interest was really, I think, a story that should have been about getting us to really reform our conflicts of interest policies, but instead it became more about, that Jose was kind of pushed to resign, which I thought was really not the answer. It's a systemic problem, and he's in quite good company among elite people who weren't disclosing, who are participating in relationships that are deeply problematic. Anyway, so I always thought it was sort of a bit unfair. And I also think it shouldn't define him. I guess I should say, you know, in the years after that debate, because it was, I think, in this narrow niche it was discussed, there were people who, came up to me and told me Baselga stories for years after. I mean, and still to this day, they feel like, you're the guy that I want to tell these Baselga stories to. And the stories they're all over the place. The story I heard was that when Mendelssohn was working on trastuzumab, of course, Denny Slayman, they had paired it with anthracyclines, and that there was this risk of cardiotoxicity. And it was Jose who actually suggested that we combine it with a taxane as well. We all know Jose as when he moved to AZ, he was really kind of a guy who's always on the gas pedal all the way. Really wanted AZ to be the best and would settle for nothing less than the best. I had people come and tell me stories about how, in these rooms with power players where everyone is Nature New England Journal, has a Nature New England Journal paper, everyone's well published, everyone is a rock star in their own field, that Jose would come and, his presence was larger than life, and that he would, push people hard, rip apart research he felt was not meritorious or going too slow, never hesitated to tell people what he thought. I heard once that he told somebody, where are you going to publish that? And the person was like, I think we're going to aim for like maybe blood or leukemia, lymphoma or leukemia. And he was like, blood, you want to publish in blood? It's like, get out of here. This is MSKCC. We publish in Nature or New England Journal, or you can get the hell out. And I don't know that to be true. I heard that secondhand. However, that to me is really spot on his personality. And I guess I would say that I admire that as well. I really do. I really admire somebody who would, I don't know if people are going to like me to say this, but I admire somebody who would say that to somebody, to say that, what you're telling me is you're at what, I think he would believe, you're at the best place. You're at the best place. I mean, I think that's what people who work there believe. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying they believe that. And if you believe that you're at the best place and you want to be the best, then you got to be publishing in the best journals. You got to be doing the best work. You got to be doing the most impactful work. I mean, this is a guy who doesn't believe in participation trophies. And I admire somebody in our world to be like that, to be always pushing, to be better at whatever you do. And all of the things he told me after these debates in private, when we bumped into each other here or there, they were always, they were never, he was good about separating the fact that we may have had substantive disagreements on all these issues, but he never made it personal. It was always about, you want to bring your argument, you better do a better job of formulating. You better bring it hard, because I'm going to push back as hard as I can. And I admire that. I admire that a great deal. And so, I know there are other people who had different interactions with him, and they're free to share their stories. But I thought he was a strong person, and they don't make him like that anymore. So I'm sorry to see. I'm sorry to hear about it, and my condolences to his family.